The teacher.
Regarded as the most famous court case in Jamaican history, the trial of the world boss Vybz Kartel and his associates lasted a record 64 days. To much fanfare and publicity, this case remains one of the most controversial events in recent times. And while the verdict was highly publicized, Addijah Palmer's lawyers continue to launch appeals against this verdict. But why? What grounds do they have to launch appeals? We look deeper into the appeals on this episode of Storytime. Before we look at the appeals, let's rewind a bit. According to the prosecution, Clive Lizard Williams and Lamar Chow were given 2 firearms by Mr. Palmer for safekeeping. Soon after, both men could not locate the weapons and rumors were spreading that they were stolen by one of the men's friends. Kartel seemingly gave both men until 8 p.m. on the 14th of August 2011 to return the firearms, a task which they were unable to do. They were therefore summoned to Kartel's house at 7 Swallowfield Avenue in Havendale to meet with him, and it is here that Lizard was murdered. The prosecution's chief witness, Mr. Chow, claimed that when he and Lizard went over to Mr. Palmer's house, they told him that they would buy replacements. Immediately after that, Kahira Jones grabbed Lizard from behind, and Mr. Chow ran into a room at the rear of the house and tried unsuccessfully to lock himself inside of it. Kartel and Sean Storm then opened the door to the room, grabbed Mr. Chow, and brought him back to the hallway of the living room. There, Mr. Chow claimed he saw Clive Lizard Williams lying motionless on his back on the ground, trying unsuccessfully to speak, while Kahira Jones stood bending over him, and Kartel's barber, Andre St. John, stood with a building block in his hands. Fearing for his safety, Mr. Chow fled from the house, climbed over the gate, and ran up the road. Lizard was never seen again by any relatives or Mr. Chow. The crime scene was later covered up and the house was set on fire. The police then arrested Mr. Palmer and his associates on September 30th, 2011, taking 10 cellular phones from them. From these cell phones, they would extract voice note text messages and videos that would be used in court. But that's only one side of the story.
Vybz Kartel police record is clean, and I have never done anything that warranted me to be in any inquiry.
According to Kartel, he never personally met with Lizard, but saw him a few times at stage shows. Meanwhile, Sean Storm said that Lizard and Mr. Chow followed him into a vehicle to Havendale. Lizard exited the vehicle at a nearby guest house, and Mr. Chow exited at Kartel's house. Later that night, Mr. Chow came to his house and told him that Mr. Palmer had received a dog bite and had to be taken to the hospital. This trial, he said, was all a plot by the Jamaican police to falsely imprison him and to prove a point. So what does the evidence say to all of this? What are the facts of the case? The 3 things that determined the outcome of this case were the cell phone evidence, the key witness, and the decisions made by the judge. These are the 3 things that Kartel's lawyer is appealing. The cell phone evidence displayed voice notes and messages which incriminated the accused. But the cell phone evidence also had its own problems. According to the reports when the cell phones were taken by the police, 2 officers verified that the phones had no memory cards, but later miraculously found memory cards in the phones. Corporal Howard received the phone from Corporal Pitt. He had the responsibility of recording what he received in a log. According to the log, he received SIM cards along with the instruments. Now, let's apply a little common sense here. To identify the SIM card of a BlackBerry phone at the time, the battery would have to be removed, and located directly next to the SIM cards would be the memory card slot. So why didn't Corporal Howard or Pitt log that they received memory cards with the phones? At first, he testified that he had logged the total amount of items that he received, including SIM cards. When questioned about the absence of SD cards, he testified that it was not his responsibility to remove or check for any such cards. That, he said, was the responsibility of the person doing the forensic examination, who was the police's chief cellular expert, Sergeant Linton. But if it wasn't his responsibility to analyze the phones, why check for SIM cards? When Sergeant Linton conducted the forensic examination, he said that he saw the SD card in the instruments. So the question is, was Corporal Howard and Pitt negligent in their examination of the cellular phones? Or was it just not their responsibility? Another weird fact regarding the cell phone evidence is that while in police custody, the cell phones of Vybz Kartel were used to send text messages and calls. When asked about this, Sergeant Linton claimed he never used the phones, but he did place them in a storage locker and left the key on top of the locker. The big question now is whether the cell phone evidence is admissible. In other jurisdictions, for example, the US, the admissibility of this evidence to the trial may not have happened mainly due to the gaps in information presented by the police regarding the location of the SD card and the use of the cell phone. This indicated the evidence may have been tampered with. If we look at the popular O.J. Simpson case, a large portion of the evidence was called into question, mainly because the police entered the property without a warrant, and it was argued that they could have planted evidence against Simpson. In fact, Corporal Linton himself testified that the data on the cell phone could have been easily changed using technology. So if Kartel's appeal reaches the Privy Council in the United Kingdom, will the evidence be deemed admissible? Thanks for watching part 1 of this 2-part series. In part 2 of this series, we will look at the other 2 reasons for appeal, the key witness and the judge.
Yeah man, because, and that is, yeah, good point.